Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is Andre Davis and our new narrative. And today I'm presenting episode 4 in a series I'm doing within the podcast called Things I Wish I Also Learned in February. And today's title is Andre's Top 5 First Blacks to Ever Do It list. And the subject basically is what capitalism and ideologies such as individual responsibility and freedom can do for you and the community and the nation. Okay, so let's kick it off right away with number 5 on the top 5 first blacks to ever do it list, and that is Madam C.J. Walker. She was born in 1867, which is a few years after the Civil War and about 100 years after the formation of the first abolitionist society in America in Pennsylvania. That was in the year 1776, and that year should sound very familiar to you. It's very important that we put that year into context as it pertains to African Americans and slaves in America. Slavery had been around forever. You can trace the institution of slavery back 9,000 years before 1776, and no one ever decided to get a group together to say, hey, we should stop this institution called slavery. So that's a bright line in the history of slavery that has walked alongside mankind forever, right? So 1400s, 1200 AD, nobody ever thought to come together and say we need to stop slavery of all people, Asian people, black people, white people, all slavery. Okay, so Madam C.J. Walker was born in 1867. She was an entrepreneur, philanthropist, political and social activist, and her claim to fame, and the reason I picked her, is her entrepreneurial spirit and her accomplishments. So she's an entrepreneur, and she is recorded as the first female self-made millionaire in America, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. So let's go women. So she did this, like I said, and she did this during a time where women had it significantly harder than they do today. Not just women, anybody, right? So kudos to her. She was able to employ thousands of people, thousands of women, and she wasn't just a millionaire. She was the first self-made female millionaire. So for capitalists around the world, those pro-capitalist people out there like myself, she is definitely someone to be admired, studied, and be thankful that, she accomplished what she did, and she paved the way for a lot of other people, and she's a great example for any entrepreneur. I don't care if you're a woman, man, white, black, Asian. If she could do it back then, man, hey, she should inspire you that you can do it today. So number 4 on my list, we're going to move away from the entrepreneur and the capitalist, so to speak. But what they have in common is a can-do attitude, and they took advantage of the advantage their environment provided them. And what their environment provided them was an ideology concerning self-responsibility. Pull yourself up, do what you have to do. Make the best of your surroundings, make the best opportunities of the opportunities you have, and if there aren't any, just create them for yourself, okay? And this is Mr. John Rock, or shall I say Dr. Rock, or the Honorable John Rock, or Professor Rock. This guy was born in 1825, and that's about 35 years before the American Civil War, and about 50 years after the first abolitionist society was born in America in 1776. He was born in New Jersey, which means he was born free. So freedom gets you certain things, like a John Rock. Slavery won't get you a John Rock, right? So Rock was one of the first African American men to earn a medical degree. In addition, he was the first black person to be admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. He was also a teacher, a doctor, and a dentist. So I guess he never put a book down, but more so than just reading, he accomplished, I mean, just so much during a time where people could accomplish so little. And now today in 2020, you know, none of the hurdles that he had to overcome are even there. I mean, I read that he had to walk 50 miles to pass the bar. I think that was him. I mean, take the bar exam. I believe that was him, or maybe the next guy on my list. But anyway, just think of John Rock. If you're out there studying, pass the bar, medical exam, algebra, whatever, like, oh, it's so hard. Really? This dude did this, and he was born in 1825, right? He ain't even had lights. And I'll get to something about lights coming up here pretty soon. So let's move on to number 3. Macon Bolin Allen. Now, he's near and dear to me as someone who's gone to law school, graduated, went through that hell. This guy was born in 1816 in Indiana, and that's around 50 years before the Civil War and about 40 years after the first abolitionist society was formed in America, basically before anybody even cared to try and stop the institution of slavery, or got together to try and stop the institution of slavery, except for, of course, the slaves. They cared, obviously. But, okay, Mr. Allen is believed to be the first African-American licensed to practice law and to hold a judicial position in the United States. Now, Allen passed a bar exam in Maine in 1844 and became a Massachusetts Justice of the Peace in 1848. That's pre-Civil War time. That's in the non-slave states. Again, slavery won't get you a Mr. Allen, right? But freedom will, right? So I think it's very important to put this into context, because a lot of times when we think of African Americans during that time, we only think of the 90% of the African Americans in this country who were in the slave states. But there were the other 10% lived in the North non-slave states. And we never really talk about them or their accomplishments. We only talk about, you know, how bad racism was, or, you know, the plight of the black man during that time, which is very important. But we can't dismiss what people in a capitalist society such as the one in the North, an industrialized society such as the one in the North, what they could accomplish without chains on them. Okay, so moving on to number 2 on this list, and that's Howard Lattimore. And if you're listening to this podcast at night and you got a light on, hey, Howard Lattimore had something to do with that. So he was born 13 years before the Civil War and about 72 years after the first abolitionist society was formed in America. Now, Howard was born in Massachusetts, surprise, surprise, a free state, in 1848. He was the youngest of 4 children from Rebecca and George Lattimore, who were slaves but ran to freedom in Massachusetts. And what did that do for all of us? Their flight to freedom allowed their son to be born free. And in 1881, that son, Lewis Lattimore, along with a guy named Joseph Nichols, invented a light bulb with a carbon filament, an improvement on Thomas Edison's original paper filament, which would burn out quickly. And he sold the patent to the United States Electric Company in 1881. So Thomas Edison, all credit due, he, you know, with the light bulb, but the filament he used would burn out really fast. So Lattimore came up with a carbon filament which would burn a lot longer, right? So he received a secondary patent, Lattimore did, in January of 82 for the process of manufacturing carbons, an improvement method for the production of light bulb carbon filaments, right? So he had the whole thing on lock. The Edison Electric Light Company in New York hired Lattimore in 1884 as a draftsman and an expert witness in patent litigation on electric lights. While at Edison, Lattimore wrote the first book on electric lighting called Incandescent Electric Lighting, copyright 1890. And he supervised the installation of public electric lights throughout New York, Pennsylvania, Montreal, and London. So this is a hell of an accomplishment. I'm sorry. The dude was born in 1848. And he accomplished all of this in a free state, under the influence of capitalism, individual rights, individual responsibility, right? He did all this without affirmative action. Can you believe that? I mean, man, it's unbelievable. Things you can get done, things that were accomplished before affirmative action even came along on the scene. It makes you wonder. Or at least makes me wonder. And number one on this list of the top 5 first blacks to ever do it list is a group. And that group, they're called the blacks who voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution. Yes, I said that. I didn't stutter. You heard it right. The blacks who voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution. All right. So what is the time frame? 1776, the birth of this nation. It was also same time for the first abolitionist society ever created in the United States. So this is around the time human beings as a race of people decided, hey, it's about time we get rid of the institution of slavery, right? During that time, you had free blacks and blacks who were enslaved, mainly in the southern states. But those who were in the free states were just free people, right? So if you learn anything from that, being black was not synonymous with being a slave, right? So where's the proof from this? I'm going to provide you with proof by quoting from Justice Curtis's dissent in the Dred Scott v. Stanford case of 1854. Now, if you happen to step into a law school, or maybe even during February you learn something about the Dred Scott case, but just a simple overview of the case, that was a case where a very racially prejudiced Supreme Court decided that the U.S. Constitution did not pertain to blacks based on the intentions of the founding fathers when the Constitution was ratified. So Justice Curtis dissented. He wrote a dissenting opinion, and I'm going to read from 2 paragraphs from that opinion to make you wonder what in the world were they thinking about when they passed this court case. I know what they were thinking about. They were trying to protect the institution of slavery in the South. But anyway, I digress. Quote, to determine whether any free persons descended from Africans held in slavery were citizens of the United States under the Confederation, and consequently at the time of the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, it is only necessary to know whether any such persons were citizens of either of the states under the Confederation at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Of this, there can be no doubt. At the time of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, all free native-born inhabitants of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina, though descended from African slaves, were not only citizens of those states, but such of them as had the other necessary qualifications possessed the franchise of electors on equal terms with other citizens, end quote. So basically, if you were free in those states and you met the other qualifications needed to vote, which was mainly being a male and a landowner. You were on equal footing with anybody else who was a male and a landowner. And in other previous podcasts, I presented examples of how free blacks own land, obviously. So if you were in those states that was just mentioned, you could ratify to vote the U.S. Constitution into existence. And I'm going to leave you with that thought for today. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and also down in the comments, like I do for every one of these episodes in this series, I'm going to put a link to a website that provides tons of information on organizations currently fighting against the institution of slavery today around the world. And I'm not just talking about human sex trafficking. I'm talking about slaves used for human labor against their will, along with sex trafficking. So instead of just talking about what happened in the past or complaining about what happened in the past, do something about it in the present so we can get rid of it once and for all in the future. Or we can have a future without it once and for all. All right, until next time, take care.